I'd like to welcome everybody to the monthly meeting of the Cahokia Archaeological Society. And tonight we have a special presentation by Melissa Ritchie, who's a postdoctoral staff member, I guess, at Washington University, and a paleoethnobotanist. And she'll be talking about sort of marginal locations in Western or Eastern and Southeast Asia and how people adapt to those, especially with their agriculture and their botany.
Exactly.
So,
I think I have a mic.
Melissa.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me out today. Tonight we're going to explore the actual incredible resiliency of culinary traditions, especially in the ways that they're able to maintain cooking practices that exist today in remarkably similar ways as they existed thousands of years ago. We're going to look at specifically how these deep-seated culinary traditions in different parts of the world have enacted selective pressures on new ingredients as they enter their cultural spheres. Specifically, I'm looking at Eastern Eurasia. But to get us into the right food state of mind, even though it is dinner time, so we might already be thinking about it, I put up here a few pictures of common foods that you might find if you're traveling Asia today. One, on the left-hand side here, are foods that are quite common in China. So here is congee. It's like a rice or a millet porridge. This is a noodle dish. This is like dan noodles. You get those in the Sichuan province. And this is a steamed bao, right? A steamed bun that's filled often with pork and vegetables. Very common in China. You'll interact with different versions of these if you travel to different areas. Yeah, but if you look at this side, you might start seeing some similarities, right? But also some unique differences. This is cuisine from Central Asia, which you might be less familiar with. This is also a noodle dish, and it's called lagman. This is a bread that's called naan. It's very common to call bread in a lot of Turkic languages naan bread, but it's quite delicious and fluffy. And you'll get different variations of it depending on which country or ethnic group you're interacting with across Central Asia. And then we also have a porridge dish as well, called goje, that usually has some sort of ground grain in it, like a flour from a ground grain, meat, and some dairy. So there's some distinct differences between these two cuisines, but there's some similarities. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll see why I picked these dishes as we pull out some of the long-standing cooking traditions that exist here, but as well some of the adaptations that occur throughout time. So like they said, I am a paleoethnobotanist, so I study ancient plant use. And just to refresh your memories, if you don't interact with plants in the archaeological record so often, we get our seeds, which is often the majority of what we're looking at are the remnants of carbonized seeds from plants that were used in the past. And we get that from taking bags of soil from our archaeological excavations and doing something called flotation, which is putting the soil into water and mixing it up a little bit. The light stuff like seeds and charcoal will float to the top. The heavy things like maybe nutshells or ceramics or bones are going to sink to the bottom. We collect those separately, and then we dry them, and then we analyze them. And so we take our samples, we put them under the microscope, and we start picking out all the stuff that interests us: seeds, other plant parts, charcoals, etc. Pick them all out. We identify them, hopefully down to the species if we are good at it. And then we count them, and we do a number of different analyses on these to understand ancient plant use. And this is how I understand food in the past. I look at the use of plants in plant-based diets, or plant use in their diets. And specifically, I look a lot at domesticated plants. So domesticated crops, often grains in Eurasia. And early on in the use of paleoethnobotanry in archaeological excavations, we found that the grain sizes are really important indicators of a lot of different things. So we started consistently measuring the metrics of these grains, the length, the width, the height of them. One, because it helps us with species identification or variety identification, but also because in the course of understanding domestication of plants, researchers identified that one of the traits of a domesticated plant, especially the grasses, the cereals, is that the seeds get bigger as they're domesticated. And that makes a lot of sense, right? If we look to the America's cousin of this, the maize, right? You think about teosinte, it's tiny, it's spindly. People in the domestication process selected for much larger grains, much larger kernels, a much larger cob, right? Until you get the delicious cob that we have today. Same thing happens to wheat and barley, to the millets, to the rice, etc. And it's part of this domestication syndrome that is identified in plants, but also in animals, with a whole host of traits that we put together and say, yes, that means it's what's domesticated, over the course of a few thousand years. There's been a couple of different hypotheses for the actual mechanism behind why grain size actually increases, right? And it could be having to do with seedling competition when things are planted, or the depth of sowing the seed, increased water or kind of the soil nutrition, that growing condition that people create that might help the plant grow nicer things. But also there's some hypotheses for the broader driver behind it, right? Yes, they're selecting for bigger grains, but also why? One of this is, the obvious, you get more food from it, right? But we have some other hypotheses about culinary choices behind this. And in particular, this comes into play when you start looking at what happens after domestication. So this is an example of the domestication syndrome of size increase in barley in Southwest Asia, so the Fertile Crescent, kind of right here. Takes a few thousand years for it to be domesticated, and then it starts moving out of Southwest Asia. And when it starts doing that, which is all these different symbols represent different regions of Europe, we start seeing a lot of variation in size, right? It kind of levels off, and we start seeing a lot of variation. And this has been called the post-domestication syndrome, where we start seeing a lot more like varieties pop up and selection for different things occurring. And in this period of time this is what I'm looking at. What happens when these grains start moving out of their centers of domestication? Not only into new environments, but also into new cultures, right? And specifically, their own culinary traditions. So this is what happens after things get domesticated. This nice little video that moves very quickly, unfortunately, but I'll pause it later. So about 10,000, 8,000 years ago, things start getting domesticated around the world. This is quite simplified, but we have wheat and barley, we have broomcorn, foxtail, millet, we have rice, we have some African millets and sorghum. Obviously, there's a whole other thing going on over here, right, in the Americas. We're looking at Eurasia right now. And then to about 1500 BC, this movement of food, or prehistoric food globalization, we figured it out. By about 1500 BC, this is the picture. We have wheat and barley, which is in the blue. It has been domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, and then it has moved eastward into Europe, and it's moved westward into Europe, and then eastward into East Asia, right? And it goes along two different pathways. One goes north along what has been called the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor in Central Asia. We know that there's lots of mountains in the middle of Asia that kind of create a big barrier, right? And it makes things hard to get back and forth. But pastoralists who live in those mountains and did thousands of years ago move up and down them really easily. And so in these mountain corridors, these valleys and mountain valleys and highlands, the agropastoralists move these crops across the mountain. And then they get down through the Hushi corridor, which is this nice little valley that's between two deserts and a plateau, and we get into East Asia. Barley also travels a southern route along the southern Tibetan plateau and also comes east. But then we also have broomcorn and foxtail millet, millets are a category of grain, of small cereals. There's a number of different species in it, but in East Asia, we're looking at broomcorn and foxtail millets. They get domesticated in northern China around 6000 BC, and then they start moving out from there. They go west along the exact same pathways around the exact same time. So they're kind of doing this, to get over into Europe. And also they move south. This is the red. They move south. So this is where we are. So now we know the timings and the pathways for this globalization event, right? So we still have a lot of unanswered questions about what happens next, right? Things have now moved everywhere, then what? So this is a number of questions that my colleagues and I have been kind of working with over the past 10 years, 15 years or so. How did people incorporate new crops and livestock into their foodways, right? Did they actually eat these new weird plants that just showed up on their doorstep, right? Or did they maybe just feed them to their livestock? Did ideologies or our systems of ideas or our viewpoints of a culture change due to the introduction of these new foods? Or did our ideologies change the new foods when they were introduced? And then also, how did these crops grow into new and often challenging environments, right? They're moving into places that are completely different than where they were domesticated. What happens to those crops? Did the cultivation strategies come with them as a package, or didn't they? And tonight I'm going to be focusing on these top two questions, but I deal with this a lot with my dissertation and my other research. So we have to start picking out what these ideologies are, what happens in these two regions, right? And a lot of research that has been done already have figured out that there are some deep-seated culinary traditions all across Eurasia that existed prior to the domestication of crops and animals. I'm highlighting two of them here because these are relevant to my research. In Southwest Asia, right, the Fertile Crescent, long before domestication, before agriculture, we have evidence of grinding and baking of grains, right? We have ovens, we have grinding stones. People are taking the wild progenitors of these grains, grinding them into a flour, and presumably baking them. And that's the system that wheat and barley get domesticated into. There's a selection for certain traits because of this. I'll get back to that. In East Asia, we have a fundamentally different type of cooking system that exists before agriculture. We have a boiling and steaming tradition. So we have these being in Lee pots, these tripod pots that we find, boiling first, and then we get a steamer added later, that exists before agriculture. And so in this system, the millets and the rice down in the south get domesticated into a boiling and steaming tradition, where they're boiling and steaming the whole grain, not grinding it. We rarely find grinding stones, and when we do, the only residue on there are acorns and nuts. So they're grinding acorns and nuts in Neolithic, but they're not grinding the grains. They're boiling and steaming them whole grain, right? And if you think about this, if you travel to China, you travel to Japan, today in the household, you're not going to quite often find an oven. You're going to find ways to cook things as a boil and steaming, right? And if you look here, where we've been colonized by Europeans who've gotten their foodways from Southwest Asia, we have ovens, because we bake a lot. Of course, now we kind of fuse, we have a huge fusion, and we do both everywhere. But that's still quite common today, right? Our main sources of cooking can still be separated from this. So this still exists. Now, if you're being domesticated into these systems, there's going to be some choices that occur. In a grinding and baking tradition, they're selecting for really glutinous varieties, the glutinous breads, right? Grains to create breads. You also, the grinding of the grain breaks down the fibers, makes it easier to digest and cook. And if you are selecting for abundance of flour, you're going to select for larger grains, because then you get more flour when you grind them. However, in the East, if you're boiling or steaming a grain whole, a bigger grain actually takes longer to cook because of the increased surface area, or the decreased surface area per grain size. When it's smaller, you have an increase of the surface area per grain, so it cooks faster. They have a lot more seeds on the head, too, of the plant. So we have these selection processes, right? We have a small grain boiling and steaming tradition. We have a larger grain grinding and baking tradition. What happens when we now mix? We get grinding and baking grains going into boiling and steaming into grinding and baking. That's where we're going. So I'm going to cover a few case studies. We'll go through each wheat, barley, and the millets and see what happens as they are moving across Eurasia during prehistoric food globalization. So first, we're going to look at when wheat goes east. And this is drawing on research by my boss and my dissertation advisor, Xingyi Liu, who's also at WashU, and a number of his colleagues who worked on this almost 10 years ago now. And this was a paper that collected the measurements of archaeological grains of wheat all across Eurasia, Central and Eastern Eurasia, to look at, in addition to a number of radiocarbon dates, to kind of solidify the timing of the movement of wheat east and also what happens to it, right? And what they find is that over the course of between 5000 and 2000 BC, the grains are moving east into China. So there's a bunch of new radiocarbon dates that solidify these pathways, and that kind of creates that map I showed earlier. This was one of the fundamental papers that do that. And what they find with the grain metrics is that as wheat goes east, it decreases significantly in size. So this map is kind of it's China's on the left and West Asia is on the right here, so we're going east that way. So the length and the breadth, so the length and the breadth of the grain significantly decreasing in size by about 30%. So wheat gets smaller as it goes to China. And of course, there could be some environmental reasons for that, right? China has an incredible monsoon system that eventually the grains get to that could have adverse environmental impacts. So that's been a hypothesis that there's some environmental conditions that could be causing this. But what they find is that there's actually a pause in the movement of wheat eastward at the border of the boiling and steaming zone in northwest China. So this map is showing the extent of these ceramic traditions and also the modern extent of that sticky variety of millet. So there's also selection for sticky millet in rice. So you think like sticky rice cakes that kind of go with this boiling and steaming tradition. And right around there, there's a pause at 1800 BC in the movement of wheat eastward. And then that's where we see that significant decrease in size, and then it moves farther east. So it pauses until it's the right size, right? So here we are. We have wheat. We got one story. I like to think it's culinary, but it could still be environmental. Let's try a different taxa, right? Barley, also domesticated in Southwest Asia, but it has a different cultivation strategies, but also it can handle environments differently. So it has, different needs. So let's see what happens to barley when it also goes east. So this is some research that I led a few years ago, where we once again gathered all the measured sizes of grains, and we also measured some ourselves of barley all across Eurasia. For all of these studies, we're in the several thousands of grains for each for the regions, and we start comparing what happens to barley as it moves eastward as well. And lo and behold, what we see is the same thing. So here is another graph where now we're moving actually eastward as we go to the right. This is South Asia, the Inner-Asian Mountain Corridor, so that Central Asian kind of corridor up the mountains, monsoonal China, and then Northeast Asia. Ignore Northeast Asia. It's interesting. It happens a lot later in time, so we think something else is going on with Northeast Asia. This is about 1,000 years later. But what we see here is there is a decrease in grain size as barley goes east. But after 1000 BC, that decrease is significant in monsoonal China. So similar to what happens to the wheat. It doesn't fully the size decreases and then it keeps moving eastward, right? And so we're seeing this decreasing length as it goes east. And not only that, the width of the grain, the breadth, stays relatively the same. So the grains are getting stumpier. They're getting rounder. They're starting to look a lot like maybe a millet. So what's happening to the millets? Now we have two different taxa that are moving eastward and following the same pattern. What happens to the millets? These are domesticated in East Asia, and they move out from there, right? It can't possibly be following a similar trend if it's environmental. So this is research led by my colleague, once again, grabbing all the measurements of millets found across Eurasia. So this is looking at both broomcorn millet. This is what it looks like. I probably should have put a picture of that from the beginning. And foxtail millet. See how they're nice and little round? They're tiny little guys. And we measured them, and we mapped them, and we were trying to see what happens to them when they move out. Lo and behold, our smoking gun, they get bigger as they go west. Right? If they're entering an adverse environment for millets because they were domesticated somewhere completely different, we wouldn't expect them to be getting bigger. Our idea of adverse climates and plants often means that maybe the plant doesn't grow as well, right? It doesn't have as much potential to get enough yield or size. So we'd expect, if it's going into a place that it's not good for it, maybe we shouldn't have bigger sizes, right? And the fact that this mirrored, I'll get to that later. Also, they're getting taller. The breadth as well doesn't change much, and they're getting taller. So they're becoming, kind of like maybe wheat and barley, maybe. That might be a stretch. And so when we put this all together, we see a mirrored process happening. We see as the grinding and baking plants go east, they're getting smaller. And as the boiling and steaming plants go west, they're getting bigger. These are, if we expected it to be solely environmental, we wouldn't we'd expect to see much more variation in the taxa-specific trends. The fact that this is happening is really interesting to us, and we interpret as these culinary deep-seated traditions really doing that selective pressure. Of course, they don't exist in a vacuum, so likely there are environmental pressures that are occurring. There's culinary pressures and maybe some other pressures we don't even know to think of yet, but we argue that this is showing culinary. Not only that, this research actually highlighted 2 potentially new culinary traditions that previously hadn't really been brought into this literature before. So in both the barley and millet studies, we also analyzed grains from the Tibetan Plateau. As we all know, the Tibetan Plateau is pretty tall. A lot of these grains come from about 3,000 to 4,000 or above 4,000 meters above sea level. And so at the Tibetan Plateau, it's a rough place to grow things. Only barley and millet are really grown today. Some other things at the lower elevations, it's pretty tough. There's a very short growing season, really crazy summers. You can't do autumn sown stuff to come up in the spring. Really cold, lots of different things. It's tough. So why do we see the largest grains on the Tibetan Plateau? The largest barley and the largest broomcorn and foxtail millet. We attribute to this to, you might guess it, a culinary choice. Because if anybody's familiar with, if you're a baker or a cooker and you think, oh, I'm going to go bake something in Colorado, you have to adjust your cooking time because of the low vapor pressure at high elevation. It impacts how long it takes things to cook. For example, at about 4,000 meters above sea level, the boiling temperature of water decreases to 87 degrees Celsius, which means it takes longer to boil something to cook it. And today, people really only boil things in pressure cookers because it's so energy taxing, especially on the Tibetan Plateau where there's not really trees. So you're using dung, which is it burns for a long time, but it's a really low heat source. It's much better attuned, much better for roasting things. And ethnohistorically and today, one of the most important foods on the Tibetan Plateau is something called tsampa, which is a ground roasted barley flour. They take the flour of barley, they mix it with butter and sometimes the tea, and they roast it. So we're arguing that on the Tibetan Plateau, we have a boiling-free zone. It's a grinding and, I should say, roasting tradition up there, which selects, once again, likely for larger grains. For the barley, there's also a wild barley landrace that grows in the Tibetan Plateau, so potentially crossbreeding with that wild barley gave it some hardier traits to grow, which also probably led to allowing for this really large grain size that we see. So we have boiling and steaming, a starchy, sticky cuisine in the east. We have a grinding, baking, gluten, dairy product system in Southwest Asia. We have our high altitude grinding and baking system. But what also happens is that in the Eurasian Mountain Corridor, we find not only pretty large grains, but if we look, the average values are pretty large. If we look at the actual spread of the data, it's really variable. If we're looking at the actual grains, we have really small wheat and barley grains, and we also have really big wheat and barley grains in like the same samples. Same with the millets. And so what I proposed for this is that the long-standing tradition of pastoralism in the Eurasian Mountain Corridor, where people are fermenting dairy, cooking dairy, they're boiling things. We have the pots that have the lipid residues of animal proteins, dairy proteins, and the plant residue. That in the system where you're already boiling things, in addition, we also have the evidence for baking. We have ovens and the grindstones with the grains. That in the system, you already have an admixture of cooking traditions. You have a mixture of a boiling, dairying, and baking tradition, which might allow for people to select for different varieties, larger and smaller varieties for different purposes. You might grow a larger variety of barley for your flour, or you might grow a smaller one because you're going to boil it in a pot. Or even if you're going to boil the large one in the pot, it doesn't really matter if you're cooking meat because it takes so long to cook the meat anyways. Your grain's going to be cooked by then. So from all of this, we have this idea that we have, right, once again, that East Asian boiling steaming, potentially an admixture in the Eurasian Mountain Corridor of a roasting, boiling, and baking tradition, and in Tibetan Plateau, a boiling-free zone. But like the good scientists we are, we want to make sure that that's what's actually happening, right? So let's really check. Is it environmental or is it a culinary selection? There are a number of arguments that have been made by our colleagues that the grain size variation seen specifically in Central Asia, but of course some other places, is actually the result of, right, these environmental constraints on the crops, like very different ecological niches that the mountains give for you to grow plants in. And so, for example, there's high winds, right? And so to prevent lodging, the plant falling over in the high winds, you might grow shorter stalks, which means you have smaller grains. So this was a very valid argument for why we might see this variety occurring, that potentially the growing conditions, this environmental condition, could be what's affecting the plant, right? You're in areas that maybe are too hot or too cold, more arid or more wet, right, than what the plant is used to. So that could be reacting in different ways. So we are going to assess that. And the way that we assess, one of the ways we can assess growing conditions in the past is by using stable isotope analysis of the plants. If you remember maybe from your high school chemistry class, an isotope is basically the chemical element that has the same number of protons but a different number of neutrons. So basically carbon has 3 different isotopes. We have carbon-12, which has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. You have carbon-13 that has 6 protons and 7 neutrons. These are both very stable. They're quite happy little guys. But then you get carbon-14 that has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. We're unstable, we're radioactive, hence radiocarbon dating, right? But because these two are stable, the isotope value from when the plant was living and then got burnt and then was put in the ground is the same if we measure it today as it was back then. So we can measure these things to understand chemically, isotopically what's happening in the plant in the past. And in plant stable isotopes, we analyze 2 stable isotopes that have carbon and nitrogen. So our delta 13C, which is how we reference our stable carbon isotopes, tells us about water conditions while the plant was growing in the past. And our delta 15N values, which references our nitrogen isotopes, tells us about soil nutrition when the plant was growing. So the reason we can look at carbon isotopes to understand watering is because when a plant is growing, when a plant is just like hanging out, when it's well watered, it will have it has pores on its leaves that open and close. And when it's well watered, they're open. And when they're open, carbon's coming in and a little bit of water is going out, called evapotranspiration. So when it's happy, well watered, those holes are open. And they're just doing their little thing, eating the carbon, right, living. But when there's a drought or when there's water restriction, it will close those holes periodically to preserve that water that's evaporating out. And when it does that, it's going to start taking in, so when it's open, it takes in preferentially the lighter isotope 12 because it's just chemically easier to assimilate. It will take in some of the heavier 13, but it prefers the 12. When it closes, the carbon becomes recycled in the plant, so it will start taking in more of that 13. So we look at basically the level of carbon-13 in the plant to see how well watered it is. Basically, the higher the big delta 13C you have in a value, the more water it received while it was growing. Okay, sorry. Sneak peek. Our nitrogen values, our nitrogen ratios, we look at a ratio of the stable isotope of 14 and 15 nitrogen to infer manuring in the past or the soil nutrition. The nitrogen cycle is quite complex. There's a lot of different ways that nitrogen can get into the soil. It can get out of the soil. The form it is in the soil, and that all affects these values, the delta 15N values. One of the major influencers of soil nitrogen is through a process of denitrification that allows the evaporation of nitrogen out of the soil, which makes the remaining soil quite enriched in 15N. Applying fertilizer will cause this process, and then we get an elevated delta 15N value. And one of the major causes of this elevated value is from the application of fertilizers, well beyond anything that a natural process can really do. So the application of, likely in the past, animal manure, because that's the most readily available fertilizer process back in the day, really significantly increase our delta 15N values above. So we can assess the soil conditions for assessing water and soil conditions. And so because of that, some researchers recently have started to say, well, maybe we can see a correlation between the growing conditions, our proxies for growing conditions, right, our carbon and nitrogen values, and grain size to see if, in fact, right? Enriching the soil will lead to a larger grain size. So they studied wheat, barley, a number of different types of wheat and barley, these two different papers. And they do find, while there's a lot of variation and some taxa specific and depending on the system that you're in, they do see a general trend, a correlation between better watered systems, better manure system, and an increased representative value, right? And so from this, we say, okay, let's test our grains. Let's see if we have a correlation between our isotope value as a proxy for our growing conditions or our environmental conditions and grain size to see if that's really what's driving our grain size. And yay for us, there's no correlation. Yay! How lucky are we? Even though some of these look steep, our values are pretty low because it's quite a small sample, but we really don't see a correlation across many of our data sets. This is barley and wheat in the Central Asian example, and this is all the barley from a couple of sites in Tibet that I have my hands on. And we really don't see a correlation. And some we see negative correlations if we want to believe that an R value of 0.26 means anything. So we once again think that while the environment probably is playing an impact on a lot of these different things, there's a culinary selection going on. And that mechanism is not necessarily how enriching you're giving the soil for selecting for that larger grain size. So kind of going back to that, from all of this, my argument is that these culinary traditions that are deep-seated, these are rooted in the foundations of food systems around the world, really have some resilient characteristics. When new ingredients are being introduced to these new systems, they're not changing the systems that they're being introduced to. They're being folded into the existing cuisines in really remarkable ways. And that's because we find that, once again, the grain size doesn't correlate with growing conditions, but also these are not taxa-specific processes. They're happening across 4 different taxa, right? And so if we come back to these photos of our cuisines, or examples of cuisine, we can see how both cooking traditions are incredibly resilient, but also they're still adaptable. Food still changes, right? This is a millet porridge. This is a boiled whole grain millet porridge, the kanji. This danda noodle, that's wheat flour in a noodle form that's boiled. So even though you're grinding your wheat, you're still boiling it. A steamed bao, that's a wheat flour that's then steamed, or not baked, right? If we come up to the Central Asian stuff, long nam, once again, a wheat or buckwheat noodle that's being boiled, but we have bread that's being baked. The same flour could also be used to be baked, right? And we have the koche, which is this incredible mix of dairy and meat and a ground millet flour that is then put in the porridge. So while the cooking traditions remain quite strong, we still adapt things, right? We still change how we're acceptable of new foods, but something at the heart still stays the same. And that's why my advisor and I like to use this metaphor that cuisine is really similar to language, in the sense that in languages, our grammar and our syntax, our sentence structure, they stay pretty stable. But we are constantly adapting and adopting new words all the time. In cuisines, the recipes stay incredibly stable. The cooking traditions stay incredibly stable. But we add new ingredients all the time. Think of an immigrant moving to a new country that doesn't have the ingredients for their recipes. They'll still try and cook their foods, but they'll use whatever they can find that most closely relates to it, right? It might invent some incredible fusion foods that incorporate a different cooking tradition with a different ingredient. And so with that, I say thank you, and I welcome any questions, and I'm happy to have a conversation about this.
I have a question. How is grain size affected by boiling? I mean, things will expand, I guess.
Yeah.
And then things that are charred would probably shrink.
Yeah.
How do you account for that in your study?
Yeah, so there's a known offset for the charring process, and because all of the things that we're analyzing are charred, that offset is relatively stable. What we expect with the boiling and baking stuff is that these things are not getting into the fire to be carbonized after they've been cooked. The grains that we're finding have been accidentally burnt in some way, right? So they've been dropped out of the pan, or maybe you're roasting them before you grind them. So while, if you boil it and then you cook, then you burn the boiled bit, you're not going to have the grain look the way that they do. We do have some evidence of like desiccated noodles and charred food bits, but it's really, charred food bits look funny. Like they're like these little like clumpy things. So that's how we kind of are accounting for that, and the fact that these grains are probably not coming from the post-cooking process. Yeah.
So if I were a farmer in the western part of Eastern Asia, where I had the boiling tradition and the small grain tradition, or maybe even in the area where the pause, and so these big wheat and barley grains are coming in, and I'm saying, oh, those are too big.
Yeah.
So how would and the environment isn't helping me out. How would I make them smaller?
Great question. We've had a couple of hypotheses, or really, one of our projects we are like envisioning is like testing to see how quickly this could happen. No one has taken up that project yet, so maybe we have to do it ourselves. But the sowing depth could be an impact. So if you sow the seed at like a shorter depth, the grain doesn't need as much energy to get up, right? And so it might start growing smaller seeds, potentially, theoretically. If you sow it deeper, it needs that energy to kind of pounce out, so it might produce more energy-filled grains for the next time it gets into the ground that deep. That's one potential mechanism. Selection of just the big grains, or the small grains, depending on which direction you're going. Yeah.
So would that be sufficient? Would I be able to take a bag full of wheat or barley and say, okay, I'm just going to separate out the little ones? Would there be enough little ones?
Yeah. I mean, there's enough variety on a stalk of barley that there's much smaller ones on the lower bits and the much bigger ones on the top. Also, from the domestication process, we see that the increase in grain size happens. From domestication experiments, you can do that in a few generations. You can kind of create these traits in a few generations, my understanding. You can correct me, that's from my understanding of reading the domestication literature, the experiments.
It goes back and forth.
For some plants you can, for some you can't. But you can't, there's the ability to do that, but the actual process that we see archaeologically is much longer, right? Because if you don't have the intent. So if you have the intent to make it smaller, then potentially you could just do it in a few generations, right? But it's one of those projects in the back of my head that maybe I'll do one day, and I hope to do one day. Yeah. Yeah.
So I actually have an anecdotal comment.
Yeah.
And then I have a question about one of the slides as well. Your final comment about culinary traditions remaining, and that when people go to different places, they don't always have the ingredients that they had in their home country, and they kind of adapt to whatever is available. And anecdotally, I can confirm that through my own family's experience. They were immigrants from Armenia, and when they came here, they settled in Granite City, and it doesn't matter whether it's Granite City or any of the towns in this area, they did not have access to all of the grain products that they would have had in Armenia, but they adapted the same recipes by using whatever American things were available.
Exactly.
Interestingly, though, now, as over the years we've gotten international markets in our area, we've gone back to using the actual ingredients that are supposed to be used in those.
Because it doesn't taste as good. You want the good stuff, that original ingredient. Yeah.
A good example is whole wheat.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't get that, and they just used pearl barley.
Yep.
But now we've gone back to using whole wheat in some of the recipes.
Yeah. There's also an interesting thing that is all the free threshing wheat that gets into East Asia, so it's none of the hold varieties that get there. So there could be a selective process for that as well. Continue.
So I have a question also. Could you go back to one of your early slides that showed the wheat and barley when it had traveled east and west?
Yeah, the big map.
Yes.
Too many slides. This one. This one?
There.
Yeah.
So actually I was very curious that your study, you kept referring to Fertile Crescent, And by that, are you referring to the lower fertile crescent?
I'm referring to,
Tigris and Euphrates Valley, or the entire Tigris-Euphrates Valley?
I'm referring to basically Southwest Asia. So I just use it as the general term for the public term. Yeah, 100%. But if you read our papers, it's all Southwest Asia. Is what we refer to.
Up there, if you don't mind. I wanted
Yeah.
to show you something because the lower Tigris-Euphrates area, this area in here, I think is mainly what you're referring to, because this area up here actually was the kingdom of Urartu and eventually the Empire of Armenia. And that took in the upper Tigris-Euphrates area beyond the Taurus Mountains. And there, the culinary traditions that you're talking about with, especially wheat and barley, agriculture started there 11,000 BC. And by 8,000, which corresponds to what you were saying on the dates there, it was fully developed. And wheat and barley were very integral to many of the recipes that were used, the foods that we made.
Yeah.
And those haven't changed much over thousands and thousands of years. So it's a very ancient culture.
100%.
And I got the feeling from the way that you were talking that your research on the seeds really dealt with the mid to lower fertile crescent, not the mid to northern fertile crescent.
We gathered data from, depending on which study it is, either all the way out here, depends on the study. But if you look at this map here.
Do you have any particular sites that the seeds came from?
I can't remember now which sites they were. We pulled them because there's so many grains from this area. We couldn't possibly do them all. We pulled them from a couple of the some of the papers that kind of summarize a lot of the data, and because it's been well established in those regions because of the domestication syndrome. So let's start over from the early. It starts at 8,000 BC, but the data obviously goes way, like 11,000 for. Right. It's just a simplified GIF for the internet, right?
So those dates correspond very clearly. I just didn't get the feeling that you were talking about that mid to northern area, and that might be something in the future that I want to expand some research into. Definitely. Because there's very, very old sites in that area.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. And also, we really haven't delved too much into this expansion yet. So that would, be quite interesting to see if this correlates with any movement this way, or if it correlates with movement that way.
Actually, both.
Yeah, it's like the gates, exactly. There's some pretty famous valleys right there that things go through.
Also why Armenia got tea and rice very early.
Yeah, it's so central to this all. And if you look at it, it's very much this extension of this mountain corridor that really extends. And so it's just, it's a slow pace of research. But yeah, really good point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question on that slide too.
Yeah.
So help me ponder all of this. Are the seeds moving by being traded, or are the people moving?
Good question. Depends on where you are. Yeah.
Well,
so
it makes a difference on culinary traditions, right?
It does. So it really depends on where you are. Obviously, the linear beaker culture has this massive movement in Europe. Here we have we've done genetic data along the Bronze Age sites here, and we have a mix of Yamnaya expansion, which is a population that hops around up here, comes from here, and we also have a genetic population from the south. So likely, my expectation, a lot of what's happening here, this is really my focus of what I do, is we have intermarriaging happening. So maybe a man is going up, or some women are going up. We have some interconnection of small bits of movement of people this way, which probably also bring cooking traditions, and they bring how you cultivate things, etc. This is less clear. We don't really have, they're working on the genetic data for that. In other places, it could just be trade, right? And that's one of these big questions that we're still, I should add that to the list of the force.
How would you know that? I mean, maybe they're trading people and bringing seeds, maybe they're bringing seeds and maybe they're moving.
Yeah,
so can you tell from the seeds if there's any kind of isotopic analysis to tell where something originated from?
Potentially. There is something called strontium that is used in humans and like animals. The problem with strontium analysis in plants is that we don't actually know how the plants like incorporate the strontium in their cells yet. We know they take it up, but we don't know if the strontium that we're measuring is the strontium from where it was growing or like the soil that it exists in, which is a bit easier to do in human bones. So that could tell you if you have a distinct enough strontium condition of the soil arrangement around you. We do have evidence of a lot of trade and not the movement of people this way in the form of bronze technology that occurs during this time, and horses that go that way. So what's really interesting is that you have these interesting knives, these like, they call them the Scythian knives, but they're also pre-Scythians, very like flashy bronze knives that happen all up over here, and all over here. You get knife technology that goes east, but it gets incorporated into the jade culture that's over here. So they start making the knives from jade as this kind of display of wealth and power, not bronze. But we do get bronze technology in the form of them making cooking pots and cookingware from them. So in that way, there's some sort of movement of the idea of how do you do this thing, but there's also a flip on how you incorporate it, which once again could be intermarriage, it could be just distinct populations. I think genetic data or the lack of an intermixture of genetic data would tell you if it was trade or if it was just like intermarriage.
I love the idea of resiliency, but without a population displacement, do you get any examples of a total shift where it's not resilient, where one takes over the other? I guess you'd have to suspect migration in that case.
Yeah, there is an example up here. For a long time, we thought the Yamnaya do this, like, there's like a population here that's Yamnaya, and then there's out of nowhere, there's a population over here that's Yamnaya genetically, or like materially, but like we don't see anything between. So that for a very long time was seen as a migration movement. And the genetic data, yeah, might says it's migration, but it could also just be a kind of a mix through. But that's,
yeah. It's either fusion or some other kind of incorporation.
Yeah.
But without a abandonment of the previous culinary tradition.
Yeah, potentially. There's also a recent genetic data on the Tibetan Plateau found that the people on the Tibetan Plateau at this particular site, it was in the north, were Northern Chinese genetically. So that could be the movement could potentially be one of the movements of like the yak cattle situation, because cattle get introduced and they get hybrid, from northern China, this would be that kind of baking, grinding, fusion potential area, very similar to the Eurasian Mountain Corridor in the Xinjiang area. But also, it could just be this interaction, right? Does the cultivation strategies come with them? My dissertation dealt with exactly that, using the isotopes to understand the cultivation strategies and whether or not they traveled with the crops as they moved east or if they didn't. And what I found was that the very intensive the knowledge of intensively manuring and watering your crops does come. It shows up in the Eurasian Mountain Corridor. It shows up on the Tibetan Plateau. But how it gets localized is very different at each of these sites through time. So if that means it's the knowledge coming with somebody and then it gets modified through time, is it a population movement? The genetics would tell us, the data, the material culture would tell us. At this scale, it's hard to tell because we're dealing with thousands of years, thousands of sites, right? So we're kind of washing out all those idiosyncrasies of all the different sites. But yeah. I don't know if that answered your question because I don't know if I have the answer to your question.
I think when you see Eastern North America and you see the Eastern agricultural complex,
yeah,
really,
yeah, just disappear. Yeah.
So how does that, obviously it's going to be culinary and many other things, and not
right. I think it would be interesting to apply the cooking strategies of ethnohistoric communities that we know and apply those to the lost crops and see what happens. Because if it follows the same trend that occurs here, so I'm going to propose a universal theory of culinary resilience, then theoretically that should be one of the common ways we cook them, right? Not necessarily that each taxa is cooked the same way. But is there a distinct culinary practice ethnohistorically in the Americas with different crops?
Well, there were forages. There was it was
Everything.
diverse.
Yeah.
It was both baking and there was a lot of grinding.
Yeah.
And then there was also boiling. There was no reason to not do both.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then hominy.
Yeah.
And then hominy becomes such
A huge thing. Yeah.
But not because it's a brand new culinary. Well, not because there wasn't anything similar to that.
Right. There could quite possibly have been a hominy-like thing that was cooked with just the lost crops instead, right? Yeah.
But they're lost. Nobody does it anymore.
Right, and maybe because who knows, the new crops were easier to harvest or something.
Yeah, you get down to that. You
Yeah.
get down to easier,
Or-
better, or some other sort of superiority.
Yeah.
that
Is it true? Is it not? Yeah.
Is it true or is it not?
Yeah.
And how much is that our bias?
Yeah.
In a bit, because of course we
Right.
like corn better.
Exactly. And we don't really have, with the loss of the lost crops, it doesn't quite align up with a total displacement of people, right? It doesn't line up that way. So similarly, we don't have that quite, there are examples of that in various places, but at a broad scale. I don't know.
Question, you got broomcorn up there. Obviously it's not maize, but what is it?
Broomcorn and foxtail millet. Yeah, I realized about an hour ago I should have added those here and then totally forgot to put those on there. This is a broomcorn millet field. So it's a small grained cereal. So it's this category of small grained plants that people eat. Sorghum's in it as well, pearl millet's in it as well, proso millet's in it as well. These kind of exist in a lot of different places. Northern Africa has a lot of the domesticated millets as well. This is a picture of it. So this is broomcorn millet, lots of different seeds on the head, and this is foxtail millet. We see these all the time because it's in our bird seed. But you can eat it. It's tasty. It's delicious. So does that answer your question, what they are? Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I could add something to the answer that Gail was requesting. This time period that she's talking about, obviously it's thousands of years,
Yeah.
but especially in ancient times, there was so much migration and trade that only now we're beginning to realize took place. But another aspect that we need to remember, this was also a time of warfare, where sometimes entire populations were either moved out, displaced, or annihilated and replaced by other people that came in. And as they came in, they must have brought their knowledge of foods and cooking traditions as well.
Depends on where you are.
An example might be the Mongols and the Turks.
Much later.
Because like the Turkish culture, if you go to like Istanbul today, you're not looking at Turkish culture that came from Central Asia or Eastern Europe. You're looking at Greek and Armenian and Assyrian and Macedonian culinary traditions.
I would say,
Turks had adopted.
yeah, I would say a lot of what we're looking at here is prior to that massive migration of the Mongols. And so that happens in the Iron Age, and we get a completely different system that pops up after that, at least in Central Asia where I work. And the Turk ethnic identity still exists incredibly strong in Central Asia. So much so that like native, like Turkey, the speaking Turkish, like Kyrgyz speakers, Kazakh speakers often can like catch very similar words. But kind of in the West, we have evidence for a lot of that. Here, we don't quite have all that evidence yet of like widespread warfare and destruction. In some places, maybe, some places, no. The horse is domesticated and we have the chariots out there, but we find that it's not really for warfare. It's probably likely more for like men showing off and having fun. We do get like large burials later. We don't have like an incredible amount of evidence of actual like warfare on the body, if that makes sense. We get all this like gold stuff much later in the Iron Age. So yeah, I think that way we do have a lot of evidence for that right now, but we just don't have, I think we also don't have the actual sites yet to tell us that, because research here is so, like, it's only really in the past 20, 25 years that it's really gone rampant. Like my study was the first one ever to look at the isotopes on the Benton Plateau, or even to kind of collate the data in that area. So maybe as more and more research goes out, we'll start seeing the similar evidence that we see kind of Southwest Asia and in Europe, where we have such dense populated sites that have, yeah, I agree.
If it's from the movement and the blending of people, wouldn't you see a blurring of traditions?
You would think, right? Which is one of the arguments for it maybe potentially not being a fully...
So there'd be more of a trade situation. They're taking the seeds somewhere.
Yeah. And also, this is a remarkably large distance to travel. If it's people moving, like people aren't, like this, they move a lot here. Like the communities, even today on the eastern side of the Tian Shan, Zungar, Altai Mountains, are genetically and ethnically very closely related to the ones on the west. But once you get out here, this is like all Han Chinese, right? Of course, that's later, but yeah, like, so this is a remarkably large distance to travel if you're just like bringing grains in the Bronze Age. I think it's more likely through very small scale interactions that just kind of compound through time. And it's enough time for you to, if you're marrying into a new culture, more often than not, you're going to start adopting that culture if you're the lone one in, right? And then it kind of just compounds in that way. That's my view of it. Whether or not that's correct, we'll find out. But yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I like the people story behind things. I'm like, environment, who cares? People do whatever they want, you know? That's usually, it's like culture. All right. Great.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Really great question.